6 years, less 1 month ago, we had a very special service here at St. Andrew's, Hespeler. It was just before Christmas, and of course we were reading some of those very favorite Advent lessons, but even more than that, we got to celebrate a big event on that day, the baptism of Blake's big brother, Riley. Blake, who we baptized today. And I wanted to remind you of that event and help us to get a little bit of perspective on today by thinking about the things that were concerning us all about 6 years ago. You see, I keep all my old sermons, and so I know exactly what we were talking about and thinking about 6 years ago. Blake's family had just returned from out west. Her parents had moved out there to Alberta after high school because things were booming there, in the oil industry in particular, and there were tons of well-paying jobs. But 6 years ago, things weren't looking quite as rosy out in Alberta. The price of oil had simply crashed on the international markets, and the oil patch was really struggling. And all of a sudden, the employment situation was just not so great, not so stable anymore. But actually, it was another disaster that was very much on our hearts and minds at that moment. There had been a huge, and I mean apocalyptically huge, wildfire that had swept through the entire Alberta city of Fort McMurray. And it had left so much destruction in its wake that the pictures and the videos that we saw here in Ontario absolutely terrified us. Do you remember that? Do you remember what it felt like? I remember. I remember especially because Blake's family had just moved back to Cambridge from Fort McMurray. They weren't literally fire refugees, but it was pretty close. And they brought the scope of that tragedy home to us on that day. And so 6 years ago on Sunday, I was trying to see what God might be saying to us at that particular moment in time when we seem to have a lot to worry about. I mean, that wildfire, we were told, was like a once-in-a-century event, the likes of which we might never see again. But nevertheless, I wanted us to get some perspective on it. And so I turned to the scriptures of the day, scriptures that spoke fittingly of a child of promise who had been born and how things would look so very different by the time he came of age. And I spoke, therefore, about how we would look at things differently by the time that Riley came of age. And so here is what I said. The world may change, but this child, like the one born in Isaiah's time, and even like Jesus, is a sign to us from God, a sign that means that God is with us. How do I know that? I know it because that is how God works. I know it because by the time this child grows up and is old enough to know the difference between good and evil, the world will have changed. I don't even know how. Trump will not be president of the United States. Trudeau will likely not be our prime minister. The economy will have changed. And I wouldn't mind if oil isn't such a big part of it anymore. But we just don't know. But the key thing is that the things we are worried about right now, the things we are afraid of, may not matter by then. Yes, maybe we'll have new things to worry about, but even that may not matter because of one key truth that God has sent Riley to remind us of. God is with us. I share what I said that day in all humility to let you know that Well, I'm not a fantastic prophet. I mean, I have no idea why I was so sure that Trump would no longer be president. I mean, well, that was not necessarily a sure thing. And as for my prediction about Trudeau's longevity in office, I don't seem to have gotten that one right either. In my defense, I guess I was probably thinking of a time a little bit further out than 6 years. But I do think that the main point of my predictions does stand up. It is true that the particular things we were so worried about 6 years ago are not the same things we're worried about today. And yeah, some ways maybe it's because things have gotten worse. I mean, the images of the Fort McMurray fire aren't quite so shocking today as they were then, but that's because there's been so many more fires. Some of them, such as the ones in Australia in 2020, far more apocalyptic. And of course, we're not really worried about a drop in the price of oil today because the price has now become so high that it is a major driver of the inflation we are worrying about. So the things we are anxious about have changed, which means we probably should not invest so much in the specifics that we worry about. But alas, the constant seems to be anxiety itself, which never quite goes away. But enough. Enough about the worries of 6 years ago. We are here today to celebrate something wonderful. We're here to celebrate Riley's sister Blake and her coming among us and what it symbolizes. And yet I still feel as if I can't do that without acknowledging at least the anxieties and fears we are living with today. I mean, many of us today look at young families just starting out, and we wonder how they're going to be able to manage. I mean, with housing prices continuing to spiral out of control, you got to wonder how young families are going to be able to afford to provide shelter for their children. With education costs so high, we wonder how parents will be able to pay for what they borrowed to get their degrees. And of course, with prices so high, we worry about how they can find time to spend with their families when they are required to work so many hours just to make ends meet. These are huge issues for families in these days, and they affect us all. So yeah, we ought to be concerned. So let's look again at the promises that God gives us today. Let's find comfort in the faithfulness of God. This morning we read again a passage from the book of the prophet Isaiah. But the passage we read is addressed to a very different time. This passage was written at a time when the families of Judah were under enormous stress. They were a people who had been repatriated after being refugees in a foreign land. And they returned to a land that had been devastated by a series of disasters, and they were trying to rebuild. It was a difficult time, a time when they were surrounded by enemies, and they had to deal with a series of environmental and economic crises. Any of that sound familiar? And you want to know what one of these crises were? It was out-of-control inflation. The prophet Haggai was also active at this time, and this is how he describes what the situation was. You have sown much and harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And you that earn wages to put them into a bag with holes. Makes me wonder, did Haggai write that description of what things were like after walking through the aisles at the Zehrs store, looking at the grocery prices? You that earn wages, earn wages to put them in a bag with holes. He kind of knows exactly how it feels. So these prophecies in Isaiah were written at a time when the families of Judah were really, really struggling, when they didn't know if they'd be able to pay their bills, when they didn't know whether they'd have houses to live in. There's something about the Bible that makes it come up ever fresh, ever relevant to what we're living through in the moment. And so we ought to read these promises in the book of Isaiah as promises that speak to Blake and to her family, and indeed to all young families who are dealing with the challenges and trials our society is facing today. So God speaks to the prophet, and God says this: I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy, and its people as a delight. That is a powerful message for our time. It tells us of a God who has a very different orientation when looking at families than does the world at large. See, what the world is constantly doing to us is it is constantly judging all of us in terms of one thing: our productivity, our efficiency, if you will. We are reminded constantly that our value is found only in one thing, only in what we can produce for the economy to keep it going. And for that reason, families are often left scrambling and working just to justify their basic existence. But isn't it refreshing to see God's point of view is so different? Do you know why God values you and your family? It's not because of what you produce. It's not because of your efficiency. God made you as a delight. God created you because God found joy in you. I wish we could absorb that lesson in our modern world. So we have joy and we have delight. But that alone is not enough to live on. So let's see what else God is promising us at a difficult time. We have this promise: they shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall not build and another inhabit. And if there's a message our society is more in need of right now, as young families are scraping to pay their rents, to afford that down payment and that mortgage, that's the message we need. And what does it mean? What does it mean to have a God who actually cares about the housing needs of our families? How comfortable should we feel in our homes if we know that their skyrocketing values means that many a family will never be able to afford a home of their own? And of course, this is a huge problem without simple solutions. But I think it is good and comforting to know that we have a God who cares about this issue and will push God's people towards necessary change. But we do not just see God's concern for housing, we see more than that. For this is also what God promises in this passage: they shall not plant and another eat, for like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. And man, is that another issue in our society. For in too many cases, who are the people who benefit most from the labor that people do? Not the laborers themselves. The way wages are, often the lowest earning people find themselves constantly falling further and further behind, no matter how hard they work, as they scramble to pay their bills and their debts. They are not enjoying the work of their hands. Meanwhile, the investor class, the ultra-rich, those who do certainly not need to labor to earn their bread, certainly not physical labor, oh, they're getting richer and richer. And I think it's important that God puts God's self on record and says, families need to be able to enjoy the fruits of their labors. But I think maybe the greatest promise we see in this passage comes when we read this. They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity, for they shall be offspring blessed by the Lord, and their descendants as well. And that speaks to me of God's commitment to families. Oh, God is determined to bless families. God is determined to ensure that every member of every household may achieve their potential. God demands the same commitment from us. 6 years ago, we had the opportunity to celebrate a family that had just welcomed their first child, even as they came out of a vision of apocalyptic fire. And that child gave us hope for the future. Today we celebrate not only his little sister, but a family that is more firmly established here in Cambridge. And I know there are challenges there before them. Not because of anything particular in them, but because I know that's what all families at that stage are facing right now, the same struggles. Let's let the readings this morning remind us of God's commitment to families. And let it also be a renewal of our own commitment to support families in this congregation and in this community through a very trying time. Let us be bold to take on a ministry towards such families, because we can never doubt God's commitment to them. And thank you. Thank you, Blake, for reminding us of all that today. Lord our God, bless Blake and her family as they try to make the most meaningful lives for every member of that household. We pray for your blessing on the families we know today who may be struggling economically or in other terms because of just the things that are going on in our society. Thank you for your commitment to all such families. Amen.